Hello, my name is Dr. Ted Corcovilos. I'm a professor at Duquesne University in the Department of Physics. This is a brief presentation about the research I do in the area of experimental atomic, molecular, and optical physics, or AMO for short. What do atomic physicists do? We study the interactions between light and atoms, and then use these interactions as tools to study many things. For example, the fundamental questions of quantum mechanics. How does information get stored in matter? What really happens when we measure something? And can we explain the spooky parts of quantum physics in a simple way? We also look at the way atoms assemble to create real materials such as metals, semiconductors, and exotic things like superconductors and quasicrystals. Quasicrystals are the topic of my own research. We also study the boundary between chemistry and physics. How do the rules of quantum mechanics apply to larger things like molecules, especially things like biomolecules that are extremely large? Let me give a brief overview of my research program. My research topics fall into two main categories. First, what I call basic research, which are the fundamental questions of physics, and the second are applied research, where we use the tools of physics to study other problems. Our basic research project is to use ultra-cold atoms as building blocks for the quantum simulation of materials, and in particular quasicrystals. Some of our applied research projects are optical environmental sensors for lead, fluoride, and other kinds of contaminants, using infrared photodissociation spectroscopy to study chemical structures, and also to use fluorescence detection of protein structures and other large biomolecules. Today I only have time to talk about a couple of these. So first I'll talk about using our ultra-cold atoms as Legos to build things. And here's a small picture of what our experimental device will look like. And then on the applied side, I'll talk about some of the environmental sensors that we've been building. Students in my research lab get experience with all aspects of the research project. And importantly for you, all of my students are undergraduates. This means you get a lot of one-on-one time with me to learn all the processes of physics, starting from beginning to end. For example, we start with things like project planning, looking into the background literature to see what has been done before, and designing the experiments. And then we move on to things like building our collaborations with other scientists, building the experiments themselves, and then running them. And finally, we wrap up by doing data analysis, writing research presentations, and presenting posters and talks at conferences. Here's just a quick picture of my research lab where all the magic happens. In the center here, you can see a large table. This is where we put our optics and where the cold atom experiment is being built. In the back, you can see a little bit of some of our stations we use to build electronics, assemble optics, and do those sorts of things. The first project I'd like to discuss is what we call quantum simulation. This is where we use atoms as quantum Legos to build other kinds of materials. When atoms are cooled down to about a millionth of a degree above absolute zero, they stop acting like billiard balls that bounce around and instead become waves that coalesce into a single quantum object, like the Bose-Einstein condensation shown here on the right. What we do is we use these ultra-cold atoms to build artificial materials where the structure is determined by a set of lasers. The atoms play the role of electrons would in real materials. By changing the arrangement of the lasers and the forces between the atoms, we can build many types of materials. The materials we are interested in studying are quasicrystals. Quasicrystals are materials that have unusual symmetry problems, like the pentagonal shapes you see here. They break many of the usual rules of materials, but we don't have a good understanding of why they do this because we can't solve Schrödinger's equation in this geometry. We're building these using our ultra-cold atoms, and what I have here are pictures of the laser beam patterns we use. On the left here you can see an actual photograph of the laser interference pattern that builds up the structure in the center here. And then on the right is a Fourier transform of that image, verifying that we have the correct 5-fold symmetry that we want. The second project I'd like to discuss are optical sensors for environmental hazards. A wide range of chemical sensors for environmental contaminants and water quality work by changing color. For example, pool or aquarium testing kits. The photo above shows a fluoride test where you see several samples with different concentrations, and they change color as the concentration changes. Most of these tests require the user to match the color of the sample to a printed table of color swatches, and this is prone to error and is not very precise. What we can do is quantify these tests by measuring color directly using a camera or a specialized sensor. Here's a couple pictures of our homemade sensors. On the left, you see a 6-color sensor which uses a white LED and 6 different color photodiodes to measure the intensity of light transmitted through the sample. And below that is some data showing the fluoride samples from the previous slide. On the right was another idea we're pursuing where we actually just take a photograph of the sample and then use the camera itself to measure the color for here for example, for the red dye. Both of these are currently being developed. Just to summarize, my research group studies the fundamental properties of quantum mechanics, for example, in many body systems like quasicrystals. And we apply our optical tools to things like analytical chemistry, environmental science, and biochemistry. There are many research opportunities for undergraduate students at Duquesne, on campus during the academic year and during the summer, off campus with our collaborators, and there's other external research opportunities. Lastly, I'd like to thank my many students who have worked on these projects over the years, my collaborators you see here, and our funding agencies, such as things inside the Bear School, the Charles E. Kaufman Foundation, and Innovation Works. Lastly, thank you for your time, and I hope to see you soon at Duquesne.